Hello, I'm Janet Ayers, and in this segment we're going to talk about ethics in leadership. So I want to start by talking about what is ethics and what does that mean. Really, ethics is about who we are. It's about our being, our character, but it's also about what we do and the consequences that our actions have on others. So as we go through this segment, I'd like for you to think about your own ethics and your own behavior as an individual, and particularly in leadership. Also ethics in our organizations and even in our communities. Ethics is about decision making. It's about the many decisions that we make each day that are not made in a void. Many of our decisions are made based on our values and what we deem as important, and our morals that guide whether it's right or wrong for us. But we also make a lot of decisions each day that aren't ethical in nature, such as what I'm going to have for dinner or what I chose to wear today. Those are not ethical decisions. So not all decisions are ethical, but so many of the decisions that we make in community leadership as we work with others are ethical in nature, and sometimes these perspectives come in conflict with each other. There are many different ways to think about ethics, and there's no one right way to prescribe what action is good or not good. Instead, there's many different philosophies of how we interact and those consequences of our actions on others. So we're going to talk about these different ethical perspectives. We're familiar with some of these common adages, and these really represent three sort of loose groupings of philosophical perspectives of do what's best for the greatest number of people, or follow your highest sense of principle. In other words, follow the law, or do what you want others to do to you. So we're going to take a look at each of these three sort of general philosophical perspectives and talk about them as they may relate to leadership. One that we're familiar with is do what's best for the greatest number of people. This has its origins in what's called ends-based thinking or utilitarianism, consequentialism. John Stuart Mill represents this perspective. And argued that the best decisions are based on what's the greatest benefit for the greatest number of people, and what are the benefits weighing against the disadvantages. So this is a very common perspective that we see particularly in the public sphere and with elected officials who often will say, I have to make a decision based on what's best for the most people, who's going to benefit the most, the largest number of people. So we see this a great deal in the public sphere. But there are some limitations of this way of thinking. How can any person possibly foresee all of the consequences of any action? Well, you can't. How can anyone determine the greatest good for communities that are very, very diverse? Well, you can't. So there's another philosophical perspective, which is follow the highest sense of principle, follow the law, in other words. This is called rule-based thinking or deontological thinking, and Immanuel Kant is one of the major thinkers, philosophical thinkers of this perspective, who argued that individuals should do what's morally right, no matter what the consequences. And so many of the laws were made based on what was deemed to be morally right at that point in time. And so the thinking is that whatever the law is, we should follow it and let the consequences fall where they may. But there's some limitations to this rule-based thinking as well, in that it can be very rigid and restrictive, and once laws are made, it's hard to change them. And probably all of us remember in school the teacher that told us, if I let you do it, I'd have to let everybody do it. That's an example of rule-based thinking. Once you have the rules, once you have the policies, that's that. So there are some limitations, obviously, to this way of thinking as well. So another perspective is do what you want others to do to you. This is what we call care-based thinking. It's also known as the golden rule. And the person puts him or herself in the shoes of the other person and then examines how you feel about that. Can you sleep at night? Do you feel right about it? But there's also some limitations of this way of thinking as well in terms of it being very subjective. People perceive things differently, and what may be good for one person isn't really perceived as being good for others that are coming from different experiences, a different culture, a different way of thinking about issues. So as we think about ethics and leadership, and when people are asked to define leadership, they frequently provide words that deal with character, because we want to follow people who exhibit good moral character. And many scholars in leadership, when you look at the literature, actually define leadership as being ethical by its definition. But there's also a lot of argument in the literature that says, well, we can all identify some leaders in our country, either current or historically, that have had many, many followers, but their practices, their behavior, and their consequences of their actions on others are anything but ethical. So we look at what is that character perspective about leadership. A group of ethicists met in 1992 to look at the question of is there a set of values that form the foundation of a democratic society? And this became known as the Aspen Declaration. And they identified 6 characters, pillars of character, that transcend culture, politics, country. And what they said was certain core ethical values form the foundation of a democratic society. In particular, trustworthiness, respect, responsibility, justice and fairness, caring, and civic virtue and citizenship. And they felt that these core ethical values transcend our cultural, religious, and socioeconomic differences. This can be found on the Josephson Institute. I'll come back and reference this at the end. It's a site that you probably will want to check out. So another perspective of leadership from an ethical perspective can also be found in Robert Greenleaf's thinking in 1970 when he published his work on servant leadership, saying leaders should be attentive to the concerns of their followers and empathize with them. They should care for them and nurture them. And the 4 principles of servant leadership that he put forward at that time was to put service to others before your own self-interest. Listen first to others to affirm others. And through this you inspire trust by being yourself trustworthy. And it helps to nourish others and help them to become whole. 1970 was when servant leadership was published, and that philosophy of leadership is enduring even to today. Another early writer about ethical leadership was James MacGregor Burns in Transformational Leadership, where he said the interaction between leaders and their followers raises the level of morality in both the leader and the follower. And to Burns, ethics was at the very core of leadership. So when he was questioned about, well, what about Hitler, who did many evil things, Burns would reply, this was not about leadership, this was about evil doings. So as we look at some of the core elements of our ethical decision-making in our leadership, we might look at the level of our consciousness. In other words, to what extent are we as an individual aware of our values and put those values into practice A common saying that we have is, do we walk the talk? We may know the language, but are we able to put it into our practice? And do we have the competencies? Do we have the skills to be able to be consistent with what we believe are our values and the right thing to do? Plus our commitment. Do we have the courage to be able to follow through on what we believe is the right thing to do? So part of talking about ethical leadership is about talking about the courage to be trustworthy, the courage to be honest in our thinking and as we communicate with others. And this can lead us to our ethical decisions. So self-assessment that we might do in terms of what are the values that drive your leadership? Are you aware of your values as you interact with others? Do you have the skills and the knowledge to act according to your values? And are you committed? In other words, do you have the desire? Do you care enough? And do you have the courage to act according to your values? Another way of thinking about do we act ethically is thinking about our decisions and the consequences that they have on others with what we call the mother test. In other words, would our mother be proud of the way we acted? Another way of thinking is, would we want our decisions and actions on the front page of the newspaper? Or to make this more current, would we be proud to have these in the social media, on Twitter, Facebook, and other means by which we communicate? In other words, what if it went viral? Would we be proud of what we said, what we did? So I think this can lead to a really rich discussion in our community leadership programs. What can a person do to become more ethically aware? And I think in small group discussions, we can find a lot of ways in which we can become more aware of our ethics and how we put them into practice. And then what are the skills and the knowledge that we need to be able to act ethically, particularly when the stakes are very, very high, or when we are acting in areas where our emotions are very high? How can we develop those set of skills and practices? I think another great discussion question is what are some ways that we can help our organization become more ethical and act more in ways that are congruent with our values? And I think the way to determine this is to have a discussion and maybe even to put into writing. And we put our ethical principles, our ethical standards in writing, we're more likely to follow them. But I think it's more than putting it in writing. It is about having the conversations and having the discussion and holding ourselves accountable to those, because it's very easy to say things and not yet have the courage to put them into practice. So I'm going to close this by a comment that I heard. When people act responsibly for their own conduct and for the well-being of others, ethics serve to stabilize our society. Ethical leadership is the antidote to despair and cynicism that is crushing our spirit and clouding our future. Ethics is our hope. I think this is a nice comment to close with. Resources, three people that I have read a lot. I've enjoyed their books and I lead you to them, is by Craig Johnson, Meeting the Ethical Challenges of Leadership, Casting Light or Shadow. Also Michael Josephson and Rushworth Kidder. Two websites I would lead you to by the Josephson Institute of Ethics at www.josephsoninstitute.org and the Institute for Global Ethics, with some wonderful resources, curricula that's readily available, assessments, research, and other things that can help us learn and grow our own ethics. Thank you very much for being with me in this segment on ethics, and a long journey as we think about this and put our ethics into practice.